This is a response to a lot of controversy that came up when I talked about transgender students and how we can support them as a part of being supportive to everyone, because I do believe it's important to be inclusive in yoga teaching, and I don't believe that we need to judge or assess people. I believe that we can provide a space where students feel safe, and that is good yoga teaching, and that is our role as yoga teachers. I think if there are other complex issues that need to be dealt with, then that will be outside of the service that we give as yoga teachers. I wanted to just go through the issues that came up and explain how I understand the yoga philosophy to be and why that gave the position that I gave. Yogis are trying to understand the nature of reality, and the reality they describe is seamless. It's not divisible into right or wrong, moral, immoral, good or bad. Rather, they describe that all of us, all of our bodies and our minds are made up of the same stuff. The minerals of the bodies, the iron and the carbon and the calcium, they're the same minerals which are through the whole of the universe, the whole of the cosmos, the whole of the multiverse. And the way that we are energized, the animating force, is prana, and that is the same animating force. It's mahaprana if we're describing it as its role within the cosmos, and it's prana within our individual being, so that mahaprana manifests within each of us. So yoga has evolved massively with incredible innovations all the way through these different stages. Historically, we kind of chunk it up, but essentially, whether it's chanting of the Vedas, whether there's this incredible poetry and the allegories of the Upanishads, whether we have the later breathing techniques or the austerity techniques that we see some of the Buddhists practicing and some of the ascetics practicing, who break away from that orthodox tradition. So you have the Brahmanic tradition, and then you have these breakaway groups. Either way, everyone is trying to understand what is the nature of reality. They meditate to that end. They use logic to that end. They say, not this doesn't exist forever, so this isn't the ultimate nature of reality. Neti, it's called, not this, not this. Always trying to understand what is the ultimate truth. And the truth that they relate to is that we are all fundamentally interconnected beings. The self lies in the whole, and this is described in lots of different ways. So the term Atman, describing the self, sometimes described as a soul, is a part of Brahman, that which is everything, and Brahman also exists within Atman. So reality is not ever separated off. Nothing and no one is ever separated off, and so reality does not divide into binaries. And so a post that I put on Instagram that caused so much controversy was really trying to say, you know, lots of people were arguing about the whole trans thing, but the point is that you cannot divide reality in yoga terms into male and female, because binaries simply do not exist. They never are giving enough nuance, enough subtlety. And we can also find that opposing truths can coexist. In the Upanishads that I mentioned a little bit earlier, it's described that we have these sparks of fire, but they are still the fire, and that pots made of clay are still clay. And the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, a text which lots of people recognize, but it is by no means the complete story of yoga. It's a kind of summary of one aspect of yoga, if you like. Up until that point, Patanjali comes up with this 8-limb system, probably around about the 3rd century. Some people think it's earlier. But when you look carefully at what he says about asana, it describes asana as a way to experience reality beyond binaries. And he's talking about beyond the discomfort of being hot or cold in the body. But nonetheless, it's described as this way of understanding that what presents itself on one side or the other side is not the whole story, not the whole picture. And of being able to move beyond that tendency of our mind to want to jump into one thing or jump into another thing, to want to define one way or the other. And perhaps it is a nature of mind. The brain itself is split in two with this crevice through the middle. So perhaps it's something to do with the nature of our minds or the nature of our society, where we want to feel safe, that we're always wanting to take sides. So in yoga thinking, energy is moving all of the time. That prana is in continuous motion and in continuous movement. And when the prana from within our being, within our body, moves outside, when we die, it transforms and manifests into something else, and that is it. Our reality as an individual, some think it doesn't exist at all, so the Buddha thinks it doesn't exist at all. He talks about interconnectedness to the extent that there is no individual separation, whereas in some of the Indian path, in some of the yoga path, it's believed that we do have this self that which transmutates between lifetimes. Either way, the aim is to overcome our ignorance, overcome our blind spots, to realize that we are part of the whole, and this is how we start to experience ultimate liberation. One of the main ways that the yogis describe this is that the cycle of life and then death is associated with suffering. It's painful to be in these bodies, to be restricted within these bodies, because we are not physical beings. We're vast, expansive beings that happen to land in these bodies which are not particularly comfortable. They get hungry, they get cold, they die, they have disease, etc. And so we want to move beyond this cycle of life and death. That cycle is called samsara, and we're looking for freedom from samsara. And so the aim of the yogis is to find techniques which help to release us from this cycle of life and death. And it's very different from our modern understanding of yoga. So nowadays we often think we want the yoga to make us more easeful in our mind in this lifetime, more comfortable in our body in this lifetime, but we tend to not have that perspective of multiple lifetimes. We often are not perhaps believing in things like reincarnation, etc. But just to be clear, that if we're practicing yoga and if we're advocating for yoga, then the view has always been more towards multiple lifetimes, towards our being throughout our history, not just this history in this one lifetime. So I posted about Gyanyin, who is a bodhisattva, and a bodhisattva describes somebody from within the Buddhist tradition who stays around. They keep reincarnating in order to support others to attain full liberation. So they sacrifice their ability to be free of this cycle of life and death. The cycle of life and death is associated with suffering because it's never comfortable to be in these bodies. We are not physical beings. We are expansive, vast beings. We're beings of energy which have a physical form, which take on a physical form. And so this being, bodhisattva, Gyanyin, started in India as a male bodhisattva and then was adopted into the Chinese tradition, and at some time in the Chinese tradition became female and was endowed with incredible qualities of compassionate awareness and deep acceptance. And so it was very interesting that in writing about this, it caused so much controversy and so much upset from so many people who felt that this wasn't an appropriate way to be talking and that it didn't have anything to do with yoga. The yogis are seeking truth. They're not seeking some morality defined by humans. They're not seeking to appease any particular god, some of these yogis or bodhisattvas at this time. In the Vedic tradition, yes, the chanting would have been all to appease the gods, to bring the rains down at the right time, to make sure that there was enough wealth, that they could keep their cattle, etc. But beyond that, we have these breakaway groups going into, say, for Buddhism or Jainism would have been the same. These would have been the Buddha and Mahavira of the Jain tradition, stepped away from this whole Vedic propitiating the gods, etc. And they added into the tradition, which is why yoga is such a vast and such a complex tradition, essentially. Another criticism that came up is that yoga should always be ahimsa, that it should always be non-harming. And this is really interesting because, of course, we know that from the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, the very first of the yamas, the very first of the ethical precepts is ahimsa, so non-harm, followed by satya, truth. So we are always aiming to be non-harming at the same time as we're seeking to understand and pursue a life of truth and of honesty. But again, the yoga tradition isn't so simple because we have examples of people who perhaps do all sorts of violence to their bodies. They might starve themselves. Again, the Buddha was someone who did this very, very severe austerities. We see people to today doing severe austerities. We see people who hold their arm in the air for 12 years, etc. So all sorts of examples where the body is not respected, rather it can be used for the means of gaining enlightenment. So although we think, oh, yoga makes you healthy, and although we often hear, say in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, so a 15th century text from Swatmarama, although we hear like, oh, do yoga and you'll get so shiny and bright and you'll have no grey hairs and all of this stuff. And it can be useful to keep a body going healthily because it gives you longer to do your practice and longer to gain enlightenment. But in other places, so during this Hatha yoga period, so Hatha comes to its height around about the 12th to the 15th century. So for these yogis, they could use the body, and in some ways abuse the body for the aims of yoga, for the ultimate truth and liberation of yoga. So again, we can't simply say, oh, you shouldn't do anything violent towards your body. So I was having people arguing against, like, oh, people shouldn't do surgery to their body, etc. But again, quite apart from the yoga tradition, it's really outside of our remit as yoga teachers to be worried about that. My aim would always be to provide this space that feels safe for somebody to be able to come into their body, to be in their own truth. And if that person is living their own truth and living their own life, then I want to support that in whatever way that is. Providing that safe space for people is going to be the best thing for them to be able to live their truth. And that is all we can do. Beyond that is not our remit as teachers. When it comes to yoga, we can't just superimpose other morals on it. We can't superimpose, say, the morals of Christianity onto the yoga framework. You can't just push your framework around yoga and then think that it's still yoga, because it's fundamentally changed the teachings of yoga. All sorts of different expressions of God in different parts of the tradition, and sometimes expressions of non-God as well. It's not the same as saying that it's a free-for-all, we can just believe in whatever we want. We want to find a path that we can follow that works for us, so that we can be guided along that path. The physical body is just simply not that important. It's not as important as we might think, because it's just the most dense part of our being that got manifested. So you might well be familiar with the kosha model, the 5-layer or sheath model. Your physical body, your anamaya kosha, is the most dense part, and you have this microcosm macrocosm thing going on. We can offer yoga in a way which is inclusive, and I think these two things are really compatible, offering yoga in an inclusive way and the yoga philosophy, the ideas of yoga.